Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Moving Beyond Earth Gallery here at the National Air and Space Museum, and to this special occasion when we will be receiving a major new artifact into our collection. How many of you know that cameras are in the collection of the National Air and Space Museum? You probably know that we're renowned for our collection of aircraft, spacecraft, rockets, and missiles, but our smaller treasures are less well known. In fact, we have about 1,000 cameras that have been used in aviation and spaceflight in the collection of the museum. The history of flight and the history of photography and filmmaking intersect again and again over the last century. Many of the cameras we have in our collection were taken into space. From the very first camera that John Glenn bought himself to take on his Mercury flight, to the digital camera that accompanied John Glenn into space on the Shuttle in 1998. We have Hasselblads, we have Nikons, Canons, Minoltas, but until today, we have not had an IMAX camera. We collect cameras because they give us perspectives on the world and on the universe that we cannot have on our own. They show us the lay of the land on our home planet. They show us troop movements and missile sites. They show us the spread of agriculture and of deforestation. Cameras show us the features of the moon and of the planets and of the intriguing beauty of the cosmos beyond. This camera certainly fits within that realm of artifacts that are already in the collection and extend its scope because of its unique history. Today I am most pleased to introduce Graeme Ferguson of IMAX, who was the co-inventor of the IMAX camera. He was the co-founder of IMAX Corporation and served as its president. He directed and produced the IMAX films made in space. And it was his vision and his passion that inspired the whole enterprise of taking the cameras into space. After Graeme says a few words about the camera, he will be joined on stage by Peter Jacob. Dr. Jacob is our Associate Director of Collections and Curatorial Affairs. And on behalf of the entire museum, Dr. Jacob will accept the camera into the collection. Would you join me in welcoming Graeme Ferguson?
Thank you, Valerie. This must be the ugliest object that you have ever accepted into your collection, and it's particularly ironic in this building that is full of the most beautiful aircraft and objects that I have ever seen. I think that humans have invented and manufactured, and this is the exact opposite. I first saw the first IMAX camera in a workshop in Copenhagen. The camera was designed, I had commissioned a Norwegian camera designer, Jan Jacobsen, to design the camera. And I went back, he designed and built the first camera in 3 months. I went back after 3 months. Don't remember why he was working in Copenhagen. Anyway, it was perfectly pleasant. And he took a picture, took the first picture ever with the IMAX camera, which was a portrait of me. There was no way to develop the film except in a slop test. So he had, for the way photographers used to go into a dark room and pull the film through trays, and that's how he developed the film. And I still have at home this little short piece of film, which is the first IMAX film that ever ran. The camera, he focused on two things in the design. First is, it has, well, in this world you'd call it a lot of megapixels. It was a very large format, so it could hold, it could grasp or gather a great deal of information, and it was by far the most advanced motion picture movie camera ever made in terms of its ability to do that. It has an incredible information capacity. The other thing he worked very hard at, and you won't believe this, is to make it small. Because this format, which is about 3 inches, film format, a frame is about 3 inches wide. If you just scaled up a normal movie camera to take that format, it would be something like that. And if you scaled down, if you took a 16 millimeter, say, movie camera, and scaled everything down, a 16 millimeter movie camera with the same capacity would be about that wide. So that's how small this camera is. The camera is only about 9 or 10 inches wide, and the film format is a third of that. So it's an extraordinarily miniature camera, which probably nobody else would ever say about it, but it is. In other respects, other than those two, it's an extremely primitive camera. It has no mirror reflex, and movie cameras had had mirror reflex since Arriflexes in the 30s. It had no zoom. It had no turret to change lenses. It had no autofocus or auto exposure, which every point and shoot camera like that one now has. You all have that. We didn't have that. But the main thing is it didn't matter because the camera was only ever going to be used by professionals. And they could manage all this terrible stuff. So, Bill Readdy, there you are. And little did we know what would happen. The camera went into cameras. We built about 10 of them. They went into service, and nobody has a very good record as to which camera did what, but there's a good chance that this camera was used in shooting To Fly. There's a good chance it was used in shooting Grand Canyon, which is a really rugged shoot down with a lot of white water shooting. There's a good chance it was, these are what these cameras did. I don't know which one did what. It could have been used by James Nyhouse, who's sitting in the foreground in his film, The Eruption of Mount St. Helens, when he got the camera, I think, full of volcanic grit, which is about the worst thing you can put in a machine. And anyway, these cameras were pretty rugged, and in fact, very rugged. And if you examine the camera, you will see it's got a lot of scratches on it. And those scratches didn't get put on by Bill in space. They got put on by all these rough and ready filmmakers who used the camera in the earlier days. And I would say they were daredevils in their shooting, and the cameras did their best to be as good daredevils as the camera people. We were going to retire these ugly ducklings at that point, and because we had designed a much better camera, much more an easier camera with all the bells and whistles that these cameras didn't have. And it was kind of like the end of the DC-3 period. We had these good old cameras, but it was their time to go. At that point, Jim Beggs, the director of NASA, the administrator of NASA, decided that we would fly a camera on the shuttle. He took up Mike Collins's earlier proposal and said, okay, we'll put the camera in the shuttle. And we then said, okay, that's great. Now we can design the proper camera for space. We will get everything just right, and we'll do just the perfect space camera. So but we weren't quite sure what the perfect space camera was. So we took this camera down to Johnson Space Center and showed it to some astronauts and engineers, just to show what we used to do in the old DC-3 days. And now we were going to make a jet fighter of a camera. Well, Bruce McCandless changed the world. He took the camera and he opened it up and he said, can I load it? And we said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So we showed him how to load it, and he loaded it perfectly on the first trial. And then Bruce said, Sometimes when you design a new piece of equipment, and when people design a new piece of equipment and we take it into space, it doesn't work so well because there hasn't been enough time to test it and debug it and so on. So we really like to use old equipment. We used to use, and he said, do you use this equipment on the ground? And we said, we've used it for years on the ground. He said, we'll take that into space. So we were absolutely flabbergasted. We had no such idea. And the result is, this thing, about all you can see that was different is those corner bumpers are plastic, and they were put on because it was obvious that in zero-G, the pointy corners could hurt people. And there are a few internal things that got changed. But by and large, this old warhorse went, instead of being retired to pasture, as it should have been, it went off into space. And it was probably the least user-friendly piece of machinery that ever went into space. Bill can comment on that in a few minutes, but I would say it probably was right up there. There might have been a computer that was worse, but anyway, this was a pretty terrible one. It has very poor light grasp. It has a very odd kind of a reflex finder, which has a beam splitter in it. It steals half the light. That means when you're shooting in the mid-deck, where there isn't much light, and there's a model of that's an unfair model. You got a lot of light in that. The mid-deck doesn't have so much light, and that meant we had to carry lights, and the crews needed to learn lighting, which had never been on any astronaut's training schedule. And they had to take the time to light. The camera is incredibly noisy. It's so noisy that I was really happy they decided not to run it today. And we had the safety people at JSC said, you can't fly that, it will make the astronauts deaf. We finally persuaded them because it was 30-second shots. The astronauts would probably survive the camera. The camera has very short loads, runs for 3 minutes. So somebody's always having to reload it, and so that has to be scheduled into the timeline. The 3 minutes is very short. There's very little film. You can never do retakes. You got to get everything right the first time, which was a real challenge it's impossible for professionals. Professionals can never get things right the first time. So we said, the astronauts, you got to do something no professional could do. You got to get it right the first time. However, it fulfilled the vision that Mike Collins had when he first said, if you can fly the IMAX camera, it can give people an idea of what I experienced as an astronaut. And what would happen after that was quite interesting. After the first film was out, if I was sitting in the cafeteria at JSC, which is a very good place for people to meet each other and concoct new schemes, I'd be sitting there, and along would come the commander of a flight who had just been appointed to his flight, and he would come over to me and he'd say, is there any chance of getting IMAX on my flight? And that shows the power that the Dream Is Alive had to convey the story that the astronauts wanted to convey. And I think that's probably the greatest compliment. Anyway, as well as Jan Jacobsen, the original designer, my other partner, Bill Shaw, who had designed the projector, also redesigned well, you can't see it here with the camera closed, but he redesigned the movement, the movement inside. And so essentially this is a design, an invention and a design of those two men. I really wish they were both alive, or they were alive today and could have been here for this moment. This is when they should have been here. And I think to be here in this building, which is full of the greatest inventions of the century by the greatest inventors and engineers of our time, that they would have been proud beyond belief that you have chosen to select their work to join the Wright brothers' work and the wonderful architecture artifacts you have. I think they'd have had tears in their eyes if they'd been here. Anyway, I should say, in closing, that we at IMAX Corporation are so proud that you have agreed to accept the camera and put it on display, and we wish it well in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Graeme. Well, this is a marvelous acquisition for the Air and Space Museum. It represents an object, it's an object that represents really the merging of the creative arts as well as technology, the mission of the Smithsonian, the mission of NASA, the mission of IMAX. So it's an object that allows us to tell a great many stories. And we think it's a beautiful object, just as pretty as anything else we have in the museum, because it's such a rich object historically, and it's an object that has created films that have reached literally millions of people literally around the world and is able to tell that fabulous story. So that's a beautiful thing, as they say. And I'm also delighted that we're able to acquire the object today because it's brought you back to the museum. And it's allowed us now to hear some of your stories and some of your insights about the creation of this technology and the creation of the film. So we look forward to hearing more from you about the story behind the camera and how you used it and how your colleagues used it in a few minutes. So on behalf of the National Air and Space Museum's director, Jack Daly, and all of my colleagues here at the museum, we are delighted to accept this as our latest acquisition to the museum. Thank you very much.
I would now like to invite the other participants in our program to the stage. Thank you, Peter, for accepting this object on our behalf. And we're going to move now into a portion of the program where we will hear from each of the participants, and then we will open up the microphone on the floor to the audience for a question and answer session. So be thinking of what it is you most want to know about the IMAX camera or the making of these films. I'll first introduce each of the participants, and then in turn they are going to make some remarks. So just a few more words about Graeme Ferguson. He has been in this industry since high school, as I understand. He started in filmmaking as an intern and has spent his entire career really with the IMAX camera. He has been well acclaimed in Canada, his native country. He has received the equivalent of Oscar awards there, the Genie Awards in Canada, and he has been elected into or inducted into the Order of Canada, a very high honor, and also the Royal Academy of the Arts. So he's a hero in Canada, in the world of filmmaking, certainly. Toni Myers started her career in television in Canada and in England, and then she got into film with BBC. And she branched out from film into music and ended up working with the Beatles company, Apple, before she found Graeme, or Graeme found her. I'm not sure how you two came together, but that might be a good story. And they have worked together for 45 years. Think of that. I thought you must have been teenagers when you began. And Toni actually started at the assistant level and worked her way all the way up to be producer and executive producer, but she has written, edited, narrated. She narrated Blue Planet. She wrote all of the space films, and then she became director and producer and executive producer. So her career is a wonderful story. Next to her is Steve Chaudet of Lockheed and Lockheed Martin. And Lockheed was the crucial sponsor for these films, underwriting the cost. And in the 1980s, the initial cost of the first film was on the order of $8 million, I think. Oh. Oh, I thought it was in the millions. Well, I was going to give you credit for a lot more funding than you did. But anyway, he was the sponsor. He was the patron for these films. As is often the case, great art needs a great patron. And Lockheed initially, and then Lockheed Martin became the patron for the IMAX film. So we're delighted to have you here. And next to Steve is Bill Readdy, a 3-time astronaut who has, I believe, is the only person who has flown on a shuttle mission in 3 different roles. His first flight, he was a mission specialist. His second flight, he was a pilot. And his third flight, he was a commander. And he had a responsibility for the IMAX camera on his mission. So he's going to give us the astronaut perspective. And then Jennifer Levasseur from our own staff, who is a museum specialist in the Division of Space History. For several years now, she has been our curator of astronaut equipment and cameras in particular. She has 500 cameras and lenses and accessories in her sphere of responsibility. So that gives you a sense of how important cameras have become to space flight and to the museum. And she's doing research right now toward her PhD in history, and she's working on photography from the Apollo missions. So welcome to all of you. In addition to those on stage, thank you. In addition to those on stage, but equally important, are on the front row here James Niehaus and Greg Smith, who were responsible for training the crews. James in the basic operation of the cameras, and Greg in sound, all things sound. They are 2 of the leading experts in their field. And we also have, as a surprise, one more astronaut who filmed in space with the IMAX camera, and that is Tom Jones, a 4-time shuttle veteran. And I think we may have in the audience some members of film schools and film studies programs here in the Washington area. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to you all to make your own remarks, and we hope you will remark with an access on your own personal experience trying to merge this technology with space flight.
I think I'm going to use that.
Yes.
Thank you, Valerie. I don't know, should we sit down or we'll sit down, I guess. That's okay. There's a rule in the arts that no good work of art ever is created by a committee. And I think I'd like to make a comment on that, because I think to some extent what you saw this morning could be considered a work of art. And I think some of the other films that have been, the space films that have been made, are works of art. And if there were ever works of art, there were works that were created by a committee, it was these films. We had as well as the astronauts who were doing the filming in space, from the beginning we had a committee that was established and met in this building for 10 years. And Valerie was a member of the committee for the latter 2 or 3 films. And I saw another member, Jan Rather. Is Jan was representing Lockheed Missiles in Space, and a real force for good, a wonderful member of the committee, and many of the other, maybe some more here. Anyway, the committee consisted of representatives of the National Air and Space Museum, NASA, Lockheed Martin, and the filmmaking team. And that committee was so successful in making The Dream is Alive, I think it's fair to say that one of the members named us the Dream Team after The Dream is Alive came out. For the next 8 years, we were called the Dream Team, and we went on mostly having our meetings here. And everybody, I think, contributed very much, and I think it's a real proof that committees can do some very creative things. I think that's about all I have to say, and I'll hand it over to Toni.
Thank you, Graeme, and thank you for the kind remarks, Valerie. It's just great to be here this morning. I was quite surprised at how emotional I got seeing the dream again. It's been a long, long time. I also have to admit that I can't walk through the front door of this building without quaking, because I was the person who, in the post-production of the film, had to face the committee. And so every time I was just sort of like a dog that doesn't want to go to the vet, you know. Coming in from National Airport, I'd start to shake because we would show the rough cut here to the committee, and it involved how the editing was going and how the script writing was going. And so after we had screenings, we'd go upstairs to the director's conference room and face the music, as it were. So I have mixed emotions, but anyway, that was my role. It was mainly in the post-production. I also should tell you a little bit about what it's like to support a film, to support a space flight when the camera is actually being used. And we enjoyed that privilege with Bill many a time, and with Tom. Also, while the orbiter is up there with the camera going, we're supporting the flight at Johnson Space Center, James and Greg and everybody down there, and you have to negotiate your time. Every second on orbit is planned in a flight plan, and you have to negotiate your little slot to get the shot done, and you take months to do that, and then of course the launch time changes and the whole flight plan goes down the tubes, and you're starting from scratch all over again. But that is and then if you have anything you want to say to the crew, you have to send them a note. And that's a wonderful little game that in the old days was sent by P-tube. I mean, I remember as a child, you know, when you paid your department store bills through these things. And so you write out what you want to say, and then it goes up by P-tube to the back room, and then it goes from there. Somebody rewrites it there to be more clear and concise, and then it goes to the front room where somebody else rewrites it. By the time it gets to the Capcom, it's like pass the word. It's the exact opposite of what what you meant to say. But we had great fun. We even had, on these long sieges, because we didn't have enough personnel to do 3 shifts, so we were pretty 20 hours a day, but we had one astronaut who has flown, I think, with both of you, certainly with Tom, who's very famous for her cooking, and her name is Marcia Ivins. She's the size of a minute and makes cheesecakes that I gained 80 pounds on. And she'd visit us in the middle of the night and bring us stuff from the Ivins Bakery, and that's what got us through the night. It was wonderful. So that's a little, you know, I can answer questions later, but those are some of my favorite memories, is supporting flights. Steve.
Yeah, Toni, remember one time told me that, and it's always stuck in my head, that this is the first time when we did The Dream Is Alive that you had the director on the ground and the actors and the equipment in orbit. And usually that distance, obviously, is very close. So that to me was fascinating. Picking up on Graeme's point, of all the things, and I was, and although still am associated with Lockheed Martin, in the 44 years I've been connected with the company, I don't know a partnership that was as interesting or as creative, involving NASA, National Air and Space Museum, IMAX, and then my own corporation. And how we got into this is a little bit of an interesting story, and I'll just tell you too. But at Jan's company in Sunnyvale, which was mentioned, was our missiles and space company, I had the president up there call me. I was at our corporate headquarters down in Burbank, California at the time. And he said, we've got these guys from Canada have come down with this board. And it was a storyboard, and it was a bit cartoonish as you went through it. And it outlined this notion of going into space with cameras and about the size of a small microwave. I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. But and the dollar value was going to be a little under $1 million, and NASA was going to provide their full support, and the National Air and Space Museum, at the time the director was Walt Voyan, and he was very creative and very enthusiastic, and NASA, I think, threw in about $300,000. So the stars lined up for us, and in that we had just won a contract to manage the Cape. And so we had a very important relationship with our customer, NASA. And then we thought, this will be good not only for that building relationship, but it would also help NASA in their outreach to educate hopefully millions of people, particularly students around the world, on how important space is and the contributions made. And then we thought it would also be a great morale builder for our employees to see this and say, hey, Lockheed Martin's involved in something that's very significant. So that all came together, and we were able to get our management to buy off on it, although it was a bit of a struggle at first, but they finally came into it. And then the most interesting aspect of this was that, and I've never to this day known how this happened, but Ronald Reagan was president, and I had a friend of mine, and I'm a Californian originally, and I had a friend of mine who was the cabinet secretary. And he called me up, and he said, the president's interested in this IMAX film. And I thought, the President of the United States is calling us, asking us about this film. Now, he didn't quite say, you ought to do it, but he didn't have to. We got the message. And so we had, this great customer relationship. We had the National Air and Space Museum and all the other things. And then the added value was the White House came in and said, would you guys, have an interest in doing this film? And, of course, at that point, we said absolutely. And from there, we went on to do 5 films, and Jan managed one of them, and I managed and was involved with most of them. And as I said, it was a terrific relationship and a great partnership, which shows you that the private sector, a world-class museum, and a great institution like NASA can come together. And we had some very creative meetings upstairs. Sometimes we would get heated with each other, but in the final analysis, it all worked out, and the product you saw today is testimony to that.
Wow. If that camera could talk, what tales it would tell. I mean, it's amazing. I was sitting next to Toni while we were screening The Dream is Alive, and have to admit, it's very much like a time machine. It certainly takes you back to another time, another era. The images, just seem to be etched in my memory, certainly. My first experience with IMAX was sitting in that theater within weeks of its opening in July of 1976. And I was a young Navy pilot. I had just gotten my wings and was on my way to my first squadron. And I sat way up in the cheap seats watching To Fly. And I remember just being riveted, transported, particularly in the last scene where the Blue Angels are flying down the canyon. And then, of course, at the end, you've got the Paco Bell cannon, and you've got the Saturn launch, and you've got all these other things. And I remember being, transfixed and transported by that. And I felt this connection with IMAX ever since. And I never thought in a million years that I would come in very close contact and have that camera as part of my life, not just for one flight, but 3 missions. And if you can see the picture there, that's part of the time machine thing. That's a much younger Bill Readdy. At the time, we had a little boy, Sean, who was probably not much taller than that camera as it sits right there, who's now 6'2" and a sophomore in college. So that just kind of tells you about the passage of time. It's been commented upon that everything about the camera was manual, and that's absolutely a true story. The notion that we were professional camera people, though, and sound people and lighting people is kind of the same notion that some of us, pilots in particular, are scientists, just because when we go up into space, we operate that very exquisite laboratory equipment that's up there and do the work of the scientists on the ground in the microgravity of space. And so we're the eyes, the ears, and as it turns out, the hands of the professionals that really know what they're doing and design the camera and wrote the script and got the camera manifested and in the timeline. And it's a tribute to James and Greg that the meat servo here, the pilot, can actually learn to operate this camera, not simply on the ground, but then when you're in 3 dimensions and everything is floating. Imagine that magazine is floating, and then there's a can of film that you have to undo, and there's a film in the can, and then there's a magazine you got to load, and it's all inside a changing bag, and everything is floating. You're floating. Changing bag is floating. Everything inside the changing bag is floating. And you've got to successfully navigate the film out of the magazine and put it into the can, put the new film into it, and then there's daylight film, and then there's outdoor film, and then you've got to make sure that you've got the magazines all squared away. And then Bruce McCandless, of course, being a PhD, had no trouble loading the camera, but the rest of us probably spent a lot of time making sure that we had the camera loaded properly, because there was one of the artifacts of this manual camera is it had this incredibly torquey motor, and as soon as you threw the switch on, if you didn't have the camera film threaded exactly right through there, it would rip the film immediately. Or it would tear up the sprockets in the film, and of course, all that time is wasted. And it was very, very precious time that they had allotted. And sometimes it was time that you only got once during the mission because you were flying over some part of the Earth that was critical, or some scene that was going on. And you only got one take ever with this camera. So I think it's a tribute to the folks that trained us and the patience of the people that we worked with, that we were able to bring back things like you saw here in The Dream is Alive.
Well, you might imagine that my perspective on IMAX is slightly different from the rest of the panel here, because I, like many people here, grew up on IMAX. If we can have the next slide. This is where I first saw IMAX. If any of you are familiar with roller coaster rides, this is Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio, which is where I grew up. It was as I found out, the IMAX theater there, which is actually in the next slide, was the only IMAX theater in northern Ohio back in the 80s when The Dream is Alive premiered. And so at that time, I would have been just old enough to be going to this park every summer to ride the big roller coasters. And I can remember, and I was recalling this just the other day, the experience of going to see an IMAX movie was very much a part of going to that park every year. And I can remember, because having viewed The Dream is Alive, I remember having seen that in the summer of 1985. We walked in, there was a pre-show set up to kind of get you ready. But the real excitement of going into the IMAX theater, I hate to admit, was the fact that it was air-conditioned. And northern Ohio in the summertime can be really hot. I know DC gets hot, but northern Ohio does too. So it was a relief to get inside. But when that screen, when that film flickered on the screen and it popped up, you were enveloped by that screen, and I think you can still feel that today. And I know I felt that sense seeing The Dream is Alive for the first time, that I was really sort of inside that movie. I was inside the film. We can go to the next slide, I think. My next experience with IMAX was early in 2002. It was about a month before I interviewed here that I watched the news and heard about the premiere of Space Station 3D here at the museum. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever, that Tom Cruise came to the Air and Space Museum. I was stunned. I mean, I'm still at that point part of the audience, and I still feel like I'm part of the audience today. But I remember seeing that clip. You could see Toni there next to Tom Cruise at that premiere. But I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. And within a month, I'd been hired here at the museum and was completely thrilled that I would get to be in this place where we had these fabulous films coming in all the time. As I became curator of the camera collection a few years later, I started to make a somewhat perennial move to Valerie's office once in a while saying, you know, it'd be kind of neat to have an IMAX camera here. Do you ever think we might get an IMAX camera here in the collection? And on the next slide, you can see what resulted from that, which is the IMAX camera actually showing up here just a short time ago. I rushed out the day after the crates showed up. We opened them and pulled out the camera you see here. And yesterday, I had the fortune of spending the day with James Niehaus, and he assembled the camera for us. And it was really a privilege, an education, and a real experience as a curator to get to see just how these things operate. The first thing I said when we opened up the crates of the camera was that it looked homemade in a way. I grew up in a house with a father who is a machinist. He owns his own tool and die company, and many of the parts of this looked like they had been run by hand through a machine. And it just felt so familiar to me as a piece of technology, even though looking at it yesterday, I have absolutely no idea how we would ever operate it. It's an incredible piece of technology. I'm thrilled to have it here in the collection, and as part of my research, it really nicely mirrors what I'm looking at with the Apollo era, which is Hasselblad cameras being the quintessential camera of the Apollo era and the lunar voyages. I think the IMAX camera in our collection and in history will be seen as the camera of the space station era, or the space shuttle era, as well as the space station era. I think the 3D camera certainly plays a big role with how we see space and how we participate then in space flight in a way. So I'll throw it back to Valerie, and we'll get started with some questions.
A little footnote, because things that both you, Jennifer, and Bill touched on kind of are a great reminder of the really good work of this committee. I think it's summed up. Also, there was a picture of Susan Helms in that Tom Cruise shot, and Susan Helms was a member of the Expedition 2 space station crew, and I think this little anecdote really summarizes all that we could ever have hoped for. She was asked before she flew up to be on the space station for several months. She was on the Today Show, and she was asked what had inspired her to become an astronaut, and she said, the IMAX film, The Dream is Alive. I saw it when I was young and decided that's what I wanted to be. And I think that's a marvelous, you couldn't get a better testimony to the outreach and the job that these films do bringing spaceflight to young people. And so the committee should be very, very proud of that.
I should say, too, and I neglected to mention it, this camera will reside in this exhibit. You can see we've got a mock-up of a shuttle mid-deck here behind us, and it's got a nice little spot that it'll go in there. And we also were given the payload bay camera, which took this photograph that you see here, and that's going to hopefully at some point go out to our Udvar Hazy Center on display. We have a display case of cameras out there, and I'd love to see it go out there. So we have an incredible amount of equipment to sort through, but I think with some help, we should be able to put it on display in the near future.
I am so glad you clarified that, because I was going to say we have been neglecting the second camera. We tend to talk about the IMAX camera generically, but in fact, IMAX has given us both cameras. They flew on 17 shuttle missions and were used right up until the point that IMAX switched over to 3D. So they have a great history, and through them we can really tell the whole story of the shuttle era. One quick comment before I toss out a question for you. Graeme was talking about how the camera was modified for spaceflight by adding the plastic bumpers. If you approach the stage later, you'll notice another telltale sign that it has been adapted for space, and that is Velcro. There is Velcro all over it so that it can be attached to various places in the crew cabin, or various bits and pieces can be attached to it. Velcro on an object indicates to us it has gone into space. Before we go to audience question and answer, I'd like to ask a couple of you, whoever wishes to comment on the difference between shooting film and making a film. The difference between operating a camera and filming, being a cinematographer, let's say, you can learn how to operate the camera, but I know that your training consisted of two parts, technical training and aesthetic training. Can you talk a little bit about that, maybe from the IMAX side and the crew side?
I can say something, which is that a key thing that as we've already heard, we had essentially the crew members had to do all the jobs that a film crew does in Hollywood. And a film crew in Hollywood can be dozens of people, and even on a documentary, it's typically at least 3 or 4 or 5 people. And so the crew in space had to have all of those skills. The obvious ones we've mentioned, like loading the camera and keeping the pictures in focus and recording the sound, which Greg taught hundreds of astronauts to do. The one that kind of goes beyond the technical is the what is going to be in the film at the end. And the people who are going to decide that are at the very beginning of the film, the writer, and Toni was the writer on all of these films, and at the end of the film, the editor, and Toni was the editor on almost every film. But the point about it is that because things kept changing in space, we would expect to shoot this, and something would change in the flight, and we would be shooting that. So we said from the beginning, you, the astronauts, have got to think like the writer, and you've got to think like the editor. That's the real job you have. And so if an opportunity arises that we've never talked about in training, you become the person who is going to create the film. You seize the opportunity and you turn it into film. And I think that's the best I can say, is that unless they were also the writers and the editors and thought like writers and editors and directors, the films would not have been any good.
Do you want to comment on that too, Bill?
Well, I think in any kind of endeavor, if you have a common shared sense of the objectives, the mission, it makes it so much easier. And so when we would first meet with the IMAX team, we got kind of an overview of what it was that we wanted to accomplish with this particular film. And yes, you got into details on what kinds of things you would shoot and when you would shoot them and everything else. But having that initial idea of the story was extremely helpful. And then, as Graeme says, I mean, if you didn't capture it on film, I mean, you can't edit it out later. That was kind of the philosophy that we adopted, is it's better to have it on the film rather than come home and talk about what you might have filmed and hear about it for the rest of your life. So there's lots and lots and lots, I'm sure Tom can tell you, that wound up on the cutting room floor because we're not the artists and producers, directors, editors, certainly. But I think the guidance that Graeme just talked about, if you see something, go ahead and film it. I think really kind of guided us the whole time.
And I can add that there's some secret plotting that went on that we weren't necessarily told about in advance of, and you saw a shining example this morning in The Dream is Alive, because there was a shot that came back, and I started to look at it. It certainly wasn't on our list, and it was just of the 4 windows, of the overhead windows and the aft flight deck windows, and there was nothing in the window. And I said, why would they waste our valuable film on this shot? And then the 2 heads came up of the 2 astronauts that were on EVA. And that was something they had totally cooked up, thinking like directors, as a surprise shot. So that's just a little example of how inventive the crews are.
Oh, thank you all. This is fascinating. To the audience, you'll notice that we have a microphone on the stand, and at this point, we're willing to take questions for the next 10 minutes or so. So if there's something you would like to ask or comment on, or even if our other IMAX experienced people have something they want to say, please step up to the microphone and we will entertain your curiosity.
I want to thank James for getting into social media. I saw his tweet yesterday and decided to drive up here from Richmond and see this in person. I also learned a lot about IMAX cameras, following him on Facebook and seeing some of the pictures he's posted. I guess the question I have is, for the next generation of IMAX filmmakers, when do you see a digital format coming along that can match the resolution and clarity of IMAX that you have now? And are you guys in development of such a thing?
All right, the question is whether IMAX is in development of digital IMAX technology.
Where did you go? Oh, there you go. Most certainly IMAX is. In fact, James and I were down in Johnson Space Center just a few weeks ago, comparing a bunch of digital cameras, the current kind of state-of-the-art 4K cameras. But as you know, if you're involved in this, new chips are being built every 2 minutes, and so you know, next week there'll be another set of cameras to test. But I'm personally very interested in this because of our inability really to fly IMAX film back and forth to orbit anymore. And I certainly want to keep making space films. So that's the digital solution is the one. And also next week when we're on Mars. So yes, the answer is yes, IMAX is in development with digital image capture.
Do we have another question or comment? Surely. Well, we'll give you a chance to think a little more. Oh, Paul, do you have one?
Yeah, you were talking about allowing the astronauts to shoot some of their own stuff and so forth. I'm wondering about how much film went up on the space shuttle, because the weight considerations are already always really important, and whether the whether it was sort of like, oh, be careful, we're going to run out of film, and then towards the end of the mission it was like, film, we got to use this all up. Was every bit of film used before coming back to Earth?
I think there was never a case of any film coming back unused. But because the timeline on a flight kept changing, there's always had to be a margin. So we were always reserving a little film toward the end in case something happened that we were hoping would happen. Or sometimes it'd be as simple as we were going to pass over something, and would there finally be no clouds over that place? And so, but in terms of how much film we flew, this camera carries in that magazine about 3 minutes. We usually flew probably on the average, about 5 or 6 rolls of film, so that would be probably about 15 minutes or 18 minutes. When we had the cargo bay camera aboard, which is a camera that just lives out in the bay and cannot be reloaded. I think in the 2D days it was an 8-minute load, and that was very, 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 very precisely scheduled. One of the difficulties in scheduling is that the day-night cycle is not completely predictable. So you'll say there's something going to happen out in the payload bay, and it's going to happen at this moment. It doesn't happen at that moment. It doesn't often even it doesn't happen on that flight day. And so that a shot you thought you were going to get in daylight happens at night, and you can't shoot it. So then you've got that 30 seconds of film left. And every night at Johnson Space Center, there's a shift called the planning shift. And that shift replans the whole rest of the mission every night. It is always totally replanned every night. And that included usually Toni or one of us, or James, saying, okay, the film that we thought we were going to use for this, we have now allocated to that.
It requires a good deal of flexibility. And Bill, I'd like you to comment on that too. Whether you felt under pressure when you were shooting. Were you aware of those seconds ticking away?
I think the pressure you felt, because it's a manual camera, is to make sure that everything was razor sharp and in focus. Because you can imagine in a theater like you've just been in, if it's the slightest bit soft, it's wasted. And so I think we spent an extraordinary amount of time, measuring with the tape measure literally before we would set the lens, because you can't look through the lens. And then the other thing, of course, is you needed a manual light meter also. So you'd set everything up that way. And I think we felt that was the kind of pressure we felt, was to make sure that what we brought back, I think, was always in focus. I think we wanted to make sure that there wasn't any film left when we got back, and who knows what treasures might be on it that would be unexpected.
Yes.
James Hyder. Toni and Graeme, what was the approximate ratio of film shot in space to what actually got into the films, and how did that change over the 5 films that you made? Did it improve?
It changed quite dramatically. On the first flight, which was the flight that actually involved the, it was called 41C in NASA jargon. It was the flight in which the Solar Max was repaired. I think every shot except one got into the film you just saw. Probably on the second and third flights, every shot except 2 or 3 got in. So it was of an extraordinarily high proportion. And later on, particularly when we were trying to get Earth shots for Blue Planet, I think the percentage dropped a significant amount. But compared to any film ever made on the ground, it was an astonishingly high ratio of used footage.
Do we have another question?
This is a bit of a technical question. Given the kind of weight premium taking stuff up into space, how did you choose which lens package you were going to send into space, whether it's wide angle, normal, telephoto, depending on the mission?
For the cabin camera, it was pretty consistent. There was always a 30 millimeter lens, which is, now we've got the 40 on. The 40 is the standard, 40 millimeter is the standard lens for IMAX in terms of if you're sitting in the middle of the theater, the 40 lens gives you everything in the perspective that is most accurate for your position. Because in the mid deck, as you will see here, you can't get far enough back. The 30, which is actually a fisheye lens, was very frequently used just simply to get things into frame, and almost everything you saw in the mid deck shot in that film was shot with the 30. And then we had on most flights we had 100. Which was, these are all Zeiss lenses. They're made for the Hasselblad. And the 100 was a particularly sharp lens. And so for shooting out and getting things really sharp, that was good. And then we had about a 250 usually, which was a fairly long lens not really a telephoto, but more in the telephoto direction. The problem was much bigger on the cargo bay camera because we couldn't change lenses. We had to choose one lens for the whole flight until 3D, where we got a turret finally.
Do I see another questioner?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm just a visitor with my daughter, Marcy Washington. She works at NASA Space Center, and I'm from Palatka, Florida, living here temporarily in Fort Washington. I'm a retired educator. I'm sort of changing the script somewhat. not technology. My concern is, have either of you thought of taking such a magnificent piece of equipment in the technological field and simplify it for a high school student or a university photographer major? I think it would be an exciting thought. Has anyone thought of that idea?
I'm not sure of taking the camera.
Not the detail, just exposing them to this IMAX type of facility. Equipment.
No, it's a wonderful idea, and I think that
I just thought about
yeah.
sitting there and thought of this.
James is exactly the person you want.
I'm not in technology, so I'm
no. James, I can introduce.
Okay.
He teaches at film school. He's a professor of film. So
I teach in Orlando at a film school.
Okay.
And yes, we do that. I personally have taken it on myself to introduce my students as much as I can to the IMAX format and to keeping film going in our program.
Okay.
And as our friend who came from Richmond is a film guy, people are interested in it. They're still interested in it. So I think it's a great opportunity to keep students.
I'm talking about the 50 states. I hear you saying.
Well, they're just one of me, so
okay.
I'd be happy to do as much as I can.
Okay.
But we do. There's like a giant screen cinema association that has an educational program that's available for people. One of our representatives is here right now, so she might be interested in talking to you. But we're doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, our program has come to an end. Is there still one more?
We have two more questions.
Don't be shy of the microphone then.
Okay, my name's Elizabeth Suko. I'm an archivist at NASA headquarters. My question's for Bill. Are you taught to develop an eye for a shot, or purely the technical aspects of lighting and where to point a camera?
I think they'd be the first to tell you that can't be taught, probably. It's something that some people have an eye for. I don't claim to be one of them. I was behind the camera for an awful lot of the work as the operator, really. I would say, though, that as you float over this planet, there are things that do catch your eye, and you really feel somehow you want to bring that home with you. And so we take lots and lots of pictures. I mean, tens of thousands of pictures you probably know on every shuttle mission. Lord knows how many we've taken on International Space Station with 6 crew members up there for 6 months at a time. I mean, it's got to be staggering. But being transported into microgravity, so you're floating and you're going around the Earth once every hour and a half, and half of it's daylight and half of it's in the Earth's shadow. You see so many things that you feel compelled to bring back. So I don't know if that makes us cinematographers, but it really is something that you feel like you definitely have to take back with you.
Thank you.
I'd like to add something to that, because there was a lot of discussion, not so much by me, but by other people, about whether the proper way to make films in space was to send a filmmaker. That kept coming up from various quarters, and after The Dream is Alive, and you saw those shots, not one of those was taken by an artist. Every one of them was shot by an engineer, a pilot, or a scientist. And when they came back and we showed the footage, the question of sending a filmmaker never arose again.
I would add one more thing to that, though, and it's an amazing thing. Tom can certainly relate. Is when you sit with just a group about this size and your crewmates in an IMAX theater and see the raw footage and get critiqued by everybody. I mean, that makes you really, really try hard to make sure that you've done a good job. And that frame that they had there, you spent a lot of time training on the ground, and so they rehearse you and give you a chance to see what it looks like if it's done badly. And so the pressure's really, really on to do it properly when you get on orbit, when time and film is so precious.
Bill's way too modest, really. But just an interesting side note is that a bit of the footage, quite a bit of the ground footage that was included in The Dream is Alive was actually the training footage that the crews shot before they went into space. In the underwater sequence there, that was another astronaut training in IMAX for an upcoming flight. And the footage was so good that they did for training that were able to use it in the film.
Last question.
Actually, a comment. I'm Jan Rather from Lockheed Martin, and I don't get a chance to see Toni and Graeme that much, so I really wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you for allowing me to be a part of this wonderful partnership. Steve said it, and I feel the same way, that of all the things that I've done in my career, nothing has had more meaning for me than that partnership. I think in the aftermath of Challenger, The Dream is Alive was never more meaningful and more poignant. We kept it alive through IMAX, and I just want to say thank you. Also, one other thing, I know that this series, this franchise of space films is probably among the most successful of any franchise of movies, so it has really, really been good for the community as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. That's an excellent perspective. And I think before we thank our panelists one more time, I'd like to just end with this comment. I've heard it said by astronauts and by people in the audience that an IMAX film is the next best thing to being there. And I certainly had that feeling again this morning. And I think all of us, the millions of people who have seen IMAX films, owe you a huge debt of gratitude and appreciation for bringing the experience of spaceflight to all of us who will not ever have a chance to go. So let's thank our panelists for the donation. Thank you all so much.